Trafficante, a member of what is known as the Mafia?
I refuse to answer that question on the grounds that the answer may tend to incriminate me in violation of my constitutional rights.
Hey, what's up, guys? Thanks for checking out American Made. Today, I'm excited to welcome our guest to the channel to talk about one of the most powerful mafia families in the country at one time. He's an author of several books on the mafia, as well as appearing on A&E, the Discovery Channel, and the History Channel. He also guides walking tours of historic mafia locations around Tampa. I'm glad to have him here to talk a little bit about the Tampa Trafficante crime family. My guest is Scott Deitche. Scott, how you doing, man? Thanks for being here.
Doing well. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir. I'm glad to have you. Well, Scott, we covered a couple things there in the intro about you, but could you just give us a little background on who you are and kind of where you're from and what kind of got you interested in the mafia?
Yeah. So kind of my stock answer to how you got interested in the mafia is I grew up in New Jersey, originally from New Jersey. Grew up kind of outside New York City, so got the New York media all the time. So, I grew up, I'm in my early 50s, so I grew up in the age of Gotti. So, all the news was always Gotti. So I was always aware of mob stuff. My mom was a big fan of the old gangster movies, but it wasn't anything I was really like super interested in. But in 1990, I saw the movie Goodfellas when it first came out in theaters, and I was like, oh, what a cool movie. I want to read the book it's based on. So I read the book Wise Guy by Nick Pileggi, and that was it. From then on, I just started reading anything I can find. And around 95, I started going online, and there were a couple really rudimentary mafia sites there, and started getting interested in researching more about the mob. And then I'd say somewhere maybe like, and at that time, I'd moved to the Tampa Bay area and didn't really know a lot about the mob in Tampa. And there was a guy, his name is David Critchley. He's wrote a book on the origin of organized crime in the United States. Anyway, I met him online in like 95, and he's like, hey, I have these congressional hearings from Tampa about the mafia. And I was like, oh, I'd be really interested in that. So again, 95, he airmailed me a bunch of copies from the UK, and I read these congressional hearings, the Kefauver hearings from 1950. And there's all the stories about gambling and gangland killings in Tampa. I'm like, oh, I need to research this. And then somewhere along the line, I'm like, well, maybe I'll write a book, and had no background in writing. That's just not my degree and careers in science. So, writing nonfiction wasn't really outside of technical writing, like this kind of historical nonfiction was new to me, but soldiered through. My first book, Cigar City Mafia, actually came out just over 20 years ago in 2004, and currently working on my ninth one. So it's been a fun kind of side gig. And you mentioned the tours too. We've been doing that. This will be our 14th year doing the tours around Ybor City in Tampa as well. So yeah, it's been a fun time.
That's cool, man. Like you said, I know you've wrote about different mob families. We always hear about the families in New York and, the five families. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the mafia in Tampa. Before the Italian mafia became a dominant organized crime group there, there were several different factions that were operating in Tampa and in Florida. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So just taking a real quick step back for people that aren't super familiar with the history of Tampa. Tampa kind of starts emerging in the late 1800s. It's originally kind of a fort town. There's a fort there from the Civil War. It kind of, I'd say by the late 1880s, starts developing into more of a town. And then you get an emergence of the cigar industry in Tampa, in Ybor City, which was founded by an immigrant named Vincente Ybor, who came from Key West. So he started his cigar factory. All of a sudden, you have over 200 cigar factories at the turn of the 20th century, churning out tens of millions of cigars. It's a huge economic powerhouse. So in order to feed those factories, you need workers. So there's a large Cuban contingent that comes up to Tampa to work in the cigar factories. You have immigration from Spain, but you also have a large Sicilian population, specifically from kind of a few villages in Sicily, like Santo Stefano and Alessandria della Rocca. And they all settle in this part of Tampa called Ybor City. Around that same time, there's a guy named Charlie Wall who starts emerging in the early 1900s, and he's actually the son of one of the most prominent families in Tampa. His dad was a former mayor. Charlie takes a little bit of a different path in life, and he starts becoming involved in narcotics and illegal gambling, uh, specifically this game called Bolita. And by the early 1920s, by the time the Prohibition era starts, Charlie was kind of like top of the heap. And it's around that time, like the early to mid 20s, where the Sicilian Mafia family of Tampa starts to gain a little more power.
Okay, yeah. Now, is that what I just through research, and I know you've referred to a group called the Cracker Mob. Is that the group that this Charlie Wall was affiliated with, or is that
Yeah.
something different?
So Charlie Wall starts working together with other gangsters, kind of out more towards Orlando. So towns like Lakeland and even Orlando. And he starts interacting with homegrown gangsters out there. And a few years later, around the 1940s, they start emerging as their own kind of distinct organized crime outfit, and they're nicknamed the Cracker Mob. It's basically a bunch of good old boys out in the boonies, running moonshine, legal gambling. And really, the dominant figure in the Cracker Mob is this guy named Harlan Blackburn. And he actually becomes very closely associated with the Mafia in Tampa. So they kind of, they exchange layoff bets to each other. They run joint gambling operations, and they really kind of come together at this nexus of, hey, we're making money together, so let's partner up. And between the Mafia and the Cracker Mob, they kind of control a huge swath of Central Florida.
Okay, and then you said the Italian groups start to come on the scene. Can you talk about Ignacio Antinori a little bit?
Yeah, so Ignacio Antinori comes into the picture around 1930, and I'll talk real briefly too about another Ignacio, Ignacio Italiano. I think he was probably the first mafia boss in Tampa. He's arrested in 1928 at the Hotel Statler meeting in Cleveland, which is this gathering of bootleggers, and he's kind of viewed as probably the first like mafia boss in Tampa. But he dies in 1930 before the mafia even really starts, getting big. And Ignacio Antinori moves into that role. And one of the interesting things about the mafia in Tampa is they were always, at least in these early years, there was a strong involvement in narcotics and human smuggling. A lot of illegal immigrant smuggling through Tampa via Cuba. So Antinori has these different operations. He's involved in narcotics. He's involved in bullied and gambling, but also in illegal immigrant smuggling. And he kind of starts overseeing the expansion of the mafia throughout the 1930s as they get more powerful. But they're also coming into contact with Charlie Wall, and that inevitably leads to conflict. So you have this kind of war between Charlie Wall and his group and the mafia, and you have these independent Cuban and Spanish bolita sellers and gangsters in the mix too. So it's kind of a violent time in Tampa organized crime.
Yeah, now you talked about Charlie Wall at war with the Italians. Is that what's referred to as the era of blood?
Yeah, that's what the newspapers refer to that as. And they kind of encompass that into the 1950s because there's kind of another spate of violence, but that's more internal. The 1930s was really when a lot of the shotgun slayings happened. So they're pretty out in the open, a lot of them. None of them were ever solved. There was a lot of violence. And for everyone that was shot, I found multiple accounts of guys being shot at or, you know, shot and just injured. So it was probably a lot more violent even than the newspapers at the time made it out to be.
Now you mentioned the shotguns and stuff, and I thought that was interesting through researching and stuff that a lot of these hits were carried out with shotguns and
Mhm.
sawed-off shotguns, which that's a little bit different than well, you normally think, a pistol, or something. That was pretty interesting. How come they just did things a little bit different there?
I think there were a few reasons. There was a gun legislation reason, and it's totally escaping me now, was one of the reasons that shotguns were more readily available in Florida. Another thing is, Tampa at that time, really most of outside Tampa was not developed. So a lot of these
Hmm.
guys hunted. So hunting was real popular. So shotguns were pretty prevalent. And the other thing too is if you look at old Sicily, they use shotguns a lot there and,
Yeah.
murders in the old country. So that may have been a part of it. But I think a lot of it was just ease of access to these weapons.
Can you talk about kind of how and when Santo Trafficante Sr. comes on the scene? Through just research and stuff, from what I understand, he worked for Antonori, but kind of operated his own crew. So how does he come on the scene during that time?
Yeah. So there's a couple of like little factions or crews. There's the Deitche family, the Trafficante family, but they're all under Antonori. And they're all kind of under the umbrella of the Mafia. Well, in October 1940, Ignacio Antonori is shot and killed at a bar just outside Tampa. But Charlie Wall and his guys suffered some pretty significant losses. Wall, in fact, was the victim of three assassination attempts, all unsuccessful, but they were being targeted pretty heavily. So into that kind of power vacuum, that's when Santo Trafficante Sr. comes on the scene around that fall of 1940, early 41, and becomes, kind of that's when the kind of the Trafficante name becomes the dominant name in organized crime in Tampa.
You mentioned Belita. Can you talk about what that is and how big of a racket that was to the mafia?
Sure, sure. So Bolita starts off specifically describing one game, then kind of becomes a catch-all phrase for any kind of numbers. But really, the origins of Bolita start in Ybor City. There was a Spanish immigrant named Manuel Gallego who comes over to Ybor and he brings this game from Spain called Bolita. So the best way to describe it is you have a set of Bolita balls numbered 1 to 100, primarily made out of wood, sometimes ivory. So they would have these, they call them Bolita throwings. So people would go to these places like the El Dorado Cafe that Charlie Wall owned, and they would have Bolita throws. So you would bet, penny, nickel, dime on a Bolita number from 1 to 100. They would take this Bolita set, put it in a cloth bag, tie the bag, and they would toss it into the crowd. And someone would reach up and grab it, and whatever number they grabbed, that would be the winning Bolita number. It was a pretty simple game. They played it multiple times a night. There were some ways that they occasionally fixed the games. There's a setup at the University of South Florida that a couple of the balls they pulled aside and opened them up, and they found lead cores, so they were really heavy. So that when they would throw it, the heavier ones would tend to
Right.
lead the throw. Um, and that's what Bolita, that's really the game of Bolita. And this was generating tons of money for the underworld. Bolita was everywhere in Tampa. And then Bolita becomes kind of a catch-all phrase for any kind of just general numbers racket. So, by that time you can go play Bolita. You could buy it from the ice cream man. You could buy it at grocery stores. The cigar factories, when you got paid on Friday, you'd have a Bolita guy there if you wanted to make Bolita bets. So I've talked to people that remember Bolita guys used to go knock door to door to play Bolita. It was basically like an illegal lottery, and it was super, super popular in Tampa.
Now, how did the Trafficante family uh, get a foothold in Cuba? How I know they was heavy into the casinos and stuff. How did that take place?
So the Tampa Mafia's involvement in Cuba goes all the way back to the Prohibition era, and there was kind of a easy logistical reason for it, where a lot of these Sicilian mobsters grew up in Ybor City. It was a Sicilian, Spanish, Cuban, primarily. There were some other ethnic groups as well in there, but it was a large Cuban contingent. They were all lived together, so they spoke the language, they understood the culture of Cuba, and there were a lot of close connections between gangsters in Cuba and Miami and Tampa going back and forth at that time. So you start seeing the Tampa Mafia moving down there in the 20s. In fact, when President Machado is ousted from leadership in Cuba, he goes and stays at the house of Ignacio Antinori in Tampa. So there was always that close connection. And then that naturally built into, as they started building more casinos, the Tampa Mafia were able to get down there and really gain a significant foothold. A lot of it is because of those connections, that cultural similarities, and the fact that a lot of the Tampa guys understood and spoke Spanish, which a lot of the, Meyer Lansky didn't, Lucky Luciano didn't. So it gave them a little bit of an advantage.
When and how does Santo Trafficante Jr. when does he start coming on the scene and becoming, you know, a heavy hitter in that family?
Santo Jr. starts showing up a little bit in the 30s and definitely by the 40s. He starts becoming more active in criminal activities. But there's very little primary sources on his time. He really starts showing up around 1950. And what happens in 1950, a couple things is, from what I've heard and research, Santo Sr. starts turning over operations to Santo Jr., starts really kind of grooming him to take over. At the same time, there's another faction in Tampa led by this guy, Salvatore Italiano. They called him Red because he had reddish hair. And among his chief lieutenants is a guy named Jimmy Lamia. And Jimmy Lamia and that faction start challenging the Trafficantes. And in June of 1950, Jimmy Lamia was shot and killed in his car down by the Port Tampa Bay. And that kind of sets off this second round of violence. And for the next few years, all the way into the 50s, there's these spates of violence. First, it's this Italiano faction going up against the Trafficantes, and it's some internal house cleaning. But it's that's when Santo Jr. really takes that prominent role in the family.
And was it during that period of violence that Santo Trafficante Jr. was actually shot himself?
Yeah, that was January 1953. He was shot in the arm. A couple weeks later, his bodyguard Jimmy Longo was shot at. He wasn't hit. And then later that year, there's a couple other killings. Joe Antinori, who they believe was on the other side against the Trafficantes, and a few other people go missing. In fact, there's two guys that go up to New York that try to plead their case to the Mafia in New York, and they go up and they're never heard from again.
And some speculated that Charlie Wall was behind that, and he was later found dead. Do you think that had something to do with it?
No, I think Charlie Wall by that time was pretty much out of everything. But what I heard is that the reason he lasted so long is that Santos Sr. kind of said, hey, if you step aside, if you leave the rackets, as long as I'm alive, nothing's going to happen to you. So it kind of gave him this protective
Yeah.
order of protection. And Santos Sr. dies in August of 54. Not even 8 months later, Charlie Wall's found dead in his house. So I think all those years of grudges that he built up, they just finally decided to take him out. But really, when Charlie Wall died, he wasn't that much of a threat anymore. So I think that was just pure like grudge, revenge kind of killing.
Now, I had heard this a long time ago, but I'd actually forgotten about it until researching for this discussion. But in 1957, New York mobster Albert Anastasia was shot in a barbershop. But this is what I had forgot, that the night before that Anastasia was meeting with Trafficante Jr. And he was something about wanting to move into Cuba. Do you think that Trafficante had a hand in the murder of Albert Anastasia?
I don't, and I think that murder's pretty much been solved as being internal Gambino family business. However, the police thought he did because he was subpoenaed by the New York by a grand jury in New York City for information on the killing, and I'm sure he had a heads up that it was going to happen. So because he was the boss at the time and he was regularly meeting with, with the heads of the families. He wasn't on the commission, but they would have let him know that that was happening. And so I don't think it was a surprise to him.
You mentioned the commission. Did Tampa and the Trafficantes, did they ever sit on the whole Mafia commission?
No, it's kind of weird. I think at one time I read that Lucchese's represented them, but Chicago represented them for a while. So they always had representation. They just never were asked to be part of it. So,
Okay.
but Trafficante was at the Appalachian meeting in '57. So that meeting, where the heads of all the families got together,
Hmm.
Santo Trafficante was arrested at that meeting.
Now, we talked about the Trafficantes in Cuba, and during the rise of Fidel Castro, um, Santo Trafficante was a big player in the casinos and stuff in Cuba. Um, from what I understand, he actually funded both sides of the conflict, funded Fidel Castro and also funded the government, the Batista. You think he planned on just riding out the uprising and coming out on the other side and continue his business?
Yeah, definitely. A lot of other mobsters did too. It was a very weird mix. Guys were shifting sides. There were a lot of like soldiers of fortune down there at the time, but you had mobsters like the Manarino brothers, guys in Ohio that were sending guns to Castro at the same time. Which is probably a smart play. You played both sides. And
Hmm.
but the thing that Trafficante had, though, and I've heard this from a number of people, is well, it's a fact Fidel Castro came to Tampa quite a bit to do fundraising in years prior, and likely met with Santo Jr. at the time. So I think there was some familiarity there, and maybe Santo Jr. felt like, hey, you know, I know him. He'll let me, we're not know him well, but there's that connection there.
Hmm.
Um, but that didn't turn out that way. And after, Fidel kind of comes in, takes over, closes the casinos, opens them up again, but nobody's coming, so they end up closing again. He jails Trafficante from pressure from American authorities, and it's the only time that any boss of the Tampa Mafia has ever spent any time in prison was those 8, 10 months that Trafficante spent in Cuba. So.
What was the reason for Trafficante's arrest?
I don't recall the exact phrasing they used. It was pressure from the U.S. to hold him there, but also Castro. I think he was like I can't remember exactly how they put it, like an illegal alien there, an illegal immigrant. They wanted to kick him out,
Hmm.
but they put him in a prison with some other political detainees. So there was some politics at play there. And I spoke to a soldier of fortune that was in the prison at the same time as Trafficante. He's since long passed, but yeah, he said that Trafficante wasn't like maximum security; it was kind of low security. But yeah, he spent most of 1959 there and was released back to the United States later that year. Couple reasons why he may have been released. There are some people that think he might have struck a deal with Castro and became a double agent for him. More likely, they paid Castro off to release him.
Yeah. Now, I thought it was interesting. Trafficante's lawyer says that a lot of it had to do with his name because his name in Spanish meant he was a narcotics trafficker.
Yeah,
Is there any truth to that?
yeah, I've heard that before. I don't know how true it is, but yeah, I've had people tell me, if someone speaks Spanish, they'd often mention that's literally what his name means.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought that was interesting. Um, Now, I wanted to also ask you, uh, I wanted to ask you about Jack Ruby, that
Mhm.
shot Oswald, who is alleged to have shot the president. Is it true that Jack Ruby met with Trafficante in prison in Cuba?
Yeah, he definitely was down there at the time, and yeah, he met with Trafficante. I've talked to a few different sources that corroborated that, which yeah, that's pretty interesting. Uh, But I will say the guy, he was down there with another person, a guy named Louis McWillie, who Louis knew Trafficante well. He worked at the Sanssouci casino with him. So I won't go as far to say that Ruby was buds with Trafficante, went down there to visit him. He was
Yeah.
with Louis McWillie. It's just very strange coincidence, regardless of if he even talked to Trafficante. It's just kind of a strange.
Yeah. Yeah, it is strange. That's why I wanted to ask you because you know, when it comes to the whole Kennedy assassination, any ties any alleged ties that Jack Ruby had, he was a real low level
Mhm.
nobody, and then if he's meeting in Cuba with Trafficante that, like you said, they may not have been really good friends or anything, but just the fact that they was talking to one another, he knew some people allegedly, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, he talked about Trafficante possibly being a double agent. I wanted to ask you about his role in the CIA assassination plots on Castro. I know there was all these efforts to take him out, and they actually came to Trafficante to carry that out.
Yeah, I actually was just a talking head on a six-part documentary called Mafia Spies. It's on the Paramount Network. And obviously, 6 episodes. It goes really deep into the whole CIA mafia plots against Castro. But to summarize it in a nutshell, yeah, Santo Trafficante, Johnny Roselli, Sam Giancana, they were all approached to be part of efforts that the CIA wanted them to try to assassinate Castro. And the thought from the CIA side was that it would be culpability on their end. Oh, the mafia did it on their own, but the mafia had a vested interest in getting those casinos back. So that Trafficante gets pulled into that for two reasons. Number one, he owned a lot of the casinos in Cuba. Number two, he was living in Miami and had a lot of contacts in the anti-Castro movement because a lot of gangsters that he worked with in Cuba fled to Miami. So guys like Evaristos Garcia, who co-owned the Deauville with him, he becomes a big Bolita guy in Miami, but he also gets involved with, people that are involved with the Bay of Pigs invasion and these other anti-Castro activities. So that's where Trafficani kind of fits into there.
I just wanted to ask you about the Kennedy assassination. Frank Regano, who I mentioned a minute ago,
Mhm.
Trafficante's lawyer, he alleges that Santo Trafficante confessed to having a hand in the murder of John F. Kennedy. Do you think there's any truth to that?
Uh, well, I'll answer two things. First of all, is it true that he said that to Regano? I mean, no one will know. They're both gone. Trafficani's family says it couldn't have happened during that time period. The Regano family swears that it's true. But did Trafficani have a hand in the Kennedy assassination? So there's a lot of interesting connections between Trafficani and tangential figures in the Kennedy assassination, and as well as Carlos Marcello. Um, will there ever be, they're going to be releasing supposedly the final batch of documents. Will we really find out who killed them? Probably not. You can fit any theory to fit the evidence, but there are a lot of factual links with Trafficante and people both in the intelligence community and the criminal underworld that figure into a lot of these theories. And another one that kind of gives a little more credence to that thought process of Trafficante being involved is that they broke up a plot to kill Kennedy in Tampa, which was the where he visited right before he went to Dallas. So
Yeah, that's I've heard of that the other plot that was going on in Florida as well as Chicago and some other places. But the whole Kennedy thing, that's a whole nother, you could go really deep into
oh
that.
yeah.
But
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. So you mentioned him just a minute ago, but what was the relationship, the working relationship, and the just friendship with Carlos Marcello and Trafficante?
So there's always been close ties between the Sicilian community and Tampa and New Orleans because after the lynching of those Italian immigrants in the late 1800s in Louisiana, a number of them moved over to Tampa. So with the criminal stuff, there were close ties between members of the Mafia in Tampa and Louisiana. So Carlos Marcello's brother Joe was very good friends with Primo Lazara, who was a major Mafia figure in the 50s and 60s in Tampa. And then Carlos Marcello and Trafficante often visited each other. Carlos was seen in Tampa a number of times, Trafficante out there in New Orleans. So there was a close connection between the two of them on a friendship level, in addition to business and the mafia stuff.
Right. Now, you touched on this just a little bit ago, but we always hear that the mafia doesn't touch drugs and that sort of thing. But I know, well, I mean, I know that's not true in any of the families, but in particular, Tampa was pretty heavy in drugs. Can you talk about how they what they was doing and how they was operating as far as drugs go?
Yeah, so people you think Florida drugs, you think Miami cocaine cowboys, 1970s, 80s, but Tampa had a thriving narcotics trafficking market all the way back to the early Prohibition era. And again, part of that was the trade that was coming from Havana into Port Tampa Bay. Havana was a big way station for narcotics coming out of Europe. We're talking primarily heroin, morphine. A little bit later on, you get a little bit of cocaine, but that was never big back then. It was really heroin and morphine that were coming in. And Tampa was a hotbed of narcotics trafficking at that point. And then the mafia guys as they start getting more involved in Cuba, then they start having more of those connections. And Trafficante is implicated not as like directly involved, but like financing operations, financing shipments. His name pops up in a lot of DEA files, or the Bureau of Narcotics as it was known back then. And then even like in the 1960s, during the height of the Vietnam War, Trafficante and one of his lieutenants, they're going over to Saigon to meet with Corsican drug traffickers over there. So there are a lot of connections with the narcotics racket and organized crime in Tampa. And I would say even in the 70s, like low-level guys get involved in, cocaine dealing and stuff. So yeah, Tampa was definitely one of the families where narcotics were probably a little bit bigger slice of the income pie than others.
Right. Now, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the whole Donnie Brasco investigation,
Mhm.
and I know in the movie, that, and plus listening to interviews and stuff with Joe Pistone, they go down to Florida, and there's a Trafficante connection. They have to meet with him about setting up, and operating down there. Did he or anybody in that family in Florida, did they get tied up in any of that investigation or anything?
Yeah, there were a few. There was his brother Fano, this associate Benny Husick gets caught up in that. There's a couple other guys that are involved, but they don't really get indicted. His driver, who allegedly becomes boss later on, Vincent Lascalzo, is named in that case. But really, Trafficante is the one that gets ensnared in it. But, by the time he comes to trial, he's towards the end of his life and actually gets, because of health reasons, gets kind of severed from the immediate case. And actually, I don't want to speak out of turn, but I think he passed before that was like adjudicated on his end. There were two simultaneous cases. I can't remember one of the two. But anyway, long story short is he was swept up in the Donnie Brasco thing, but he definitely didn't meet the same fate as some of the other players.
Right. Now, how about Meyer Lansky? I know after Fidel Castro kicked all the mobsters out of the casinos, Lansky comes back to Florida. I think Miami. Was there any type of working relationship with Trafficante and Meyer Lansky?
So supposedly there was some bad blood between them in Cuba. And I don't know if it was so much bad blood as maybe competitive, nature, because Lansky had the Riviera, he had some other hotels, Trafficante had this. But they are observed a few times meeting in Miami, but I don't think they weren't really especially close. There was some overlap, and some of their guys would overlap together. But the Trafficante hung out. He was definitely hung out a lot more with guys like Angelo Bruno, the boss of Philly, who was down there in Miami. But Miami in the 1960s, Trafficante actually moves down there. That's when it really starts becoming like a mecca for mobsters from around the country. And I think at one time, almost every single family had guys that either lived in Miami full time or, snowbirds would come down for the winter. So, and even though Miami was an open city and Trafficante didn't have control over it, he was still respected enough being, the boss of Tampa that they would often go to him to whether it was just meetings or advice or just take permission to do stuff. So even though he wasn't the boss of Miami, he definitely held a lot of sway down there.
Right. Now, 1987, Santo Trafficante Jr. dies. You touched on this a second ago, I think, but who becomes the boss of the family, and what was the status of the family after his death?
Yeah, so according to law enforcement and all levels, this guy named Vincent Lascalzo becomes the alleged boss, and I'll say alleged. He's still around. He's in his late 80s now. But he takes over kind of a different family. It's a lot of the old timers are getting old and would pass away within the next few years. Illegal gambling still going on, but you see them start kind of moving into more white collar crime, get more involved in legitimate businesses, legitimate investments. So, the interesting thing about the mafia in Tampa is, and law enforcement definitely made inroads here and there, but it wasn't like one big bust did the family way. They just kind of faded away over time. So, throughout the early 90s, there's still some activity. But the last real like spurt of activity you see is actually in the Miami area in 2000. But by then, almost all of Santo Jr.'s contemporaries have passed away, and the family's definitely much smaller in stature at that point.
Yeah. Now you mentioned that the boss is still around in Florida. Do you keep up or follow with any active mobsters that are in Florida now? Do you ever cover them or
No, they're
anything
not
like
doing
that?
anything. Yeah, there's nothing really going on. I try to stick to historic stuff.
Right.
But I have talked to quite a few since my books have come out. Family members and actual guys I've written about it. That's kind of interesting. They'll tell me some things, but yeah, there really hasn't been mafia organized crime activity in the Tampa area in definitely well over 20 years.
So you think that family is pretty much died out?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, supposedly as long as there's a made guy or two left, and there's three that are left in Tampa. But yeah, again, they're all in their late 80s. They're not doing any crime stuff. So yeah, I think the family ceased to exist, and the FBI and law enforcement tends to go along with that as well.
Right. Now, have you ever heard of anything going on around there with the alleged Philly boss Joey Merlino? He's supposedly down there in Florida.
Yeah, he lives down over in Boca Raton on the East Coast. It's about 3 hours away from Tampa. Yeah, I don't think he's been over on this coast. John Gotti Jr. had some stuff going on in Tampa in the late 90s, early 2000s. That's one of the cases that John A. Light, when he was arrested, that caused him to flip and turn.
Hmm.
But
Yeah, I know he
and
was down there. Yeah.
yeah, and I've talked to John about what they had going on. So the New York and that should tell you something too, is that the Gambinos had come down to Florida and kind of there's a lot of people in law enforcement think that they kind of subsumed or took over the remnants of the Tampa guys too. So they were all kind of under the Gambino umbrella. Um,
Yeah, that's why I
but
was wondering as the
yeah.
the Tampa Trafficante family kind of gets older and kind of dies down, if some of the other families maybe came in there and kind of maybe not doing anything like it used to be, but maybe doing a few things, in Florida.
Yeah, so you had a few. You had guys like Santo Idoni, who was a capo in the Philly Mafia. He lived in St. Pete down here. You had, some New York guys would show up down here. There was a Cleveland guy down here for a while. Harry Fontana, who was a capo in the Colombo family, lived here in Tampa. But, these are one or two guys, and I'm sure they kind of, you know, make sure they talk to the right people before coming down.
Yeah.
But yeah, just by virtue of it being Florida, you're going to get people from up north coming down to the
Yeah.
area.
Well, man, before we wrap it up, I know you've wrote several books about Tampa and the Traficantes. What are some of the other books that you've written about, and then where can people go to purchase those books?
Sure. So probably my other well-known books, Garden State Gangland, which was the first ever kind of overarching history of the mafia in New Jersey. I wrote that a few years ago. Also, Hitmen, which is a book about the East Harlem Purple Gang, which was a group of kind of up-and-coming mobsters in East Harlem in the 1970s, very involved in drugs. We talked about drugs before, and became this violent group of mob guys, and some of whom got made into the five families, and one of whom, Michael Mancuso, is supposedly the boss currently of the Bonanno crime family, and he got his start with this gang. So it was kind of like a farm league for some of the five families. And then I'm currently working on a book, New Jersey Mafia boss Jerry Katina, and probably one of the least known about, significant crime figures. So one of the things I like to do is write about stuff that hasn't been written before or very undercovered.
Right.
We don't need another Gotti or Capone book. There's a lot of other great stories and of organized crime in the underworld. So, and where could people find my book? You can find it on Amazon, or you go to tampamafia.com. We have everything about our tours there, my books there. It's kind of a one-stop shop. You can get some cool swag too.
Awesome, man. Well, Scott, this has been fascinating. I'm always interested in learning, like you just said, about something other than the New York families
Mm,
or the Gottis or Capones. Something that's not always talked about. So I appreciate you giving me a little bit of time and talking with me and coming on the channel. I appreciate that, man.
absolutely. This was great. Thanks for having me on.
All right, man. All right, guys. Thank y'all for checking out this video. Be sure to check out his website and his books and purchase those. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe and keep following American Made. I appreciate it.